Please welcome Professor Dr. Othmar Issing.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a pleasure to be here again. And as our charming moderator mentioned, when I suggested this title, a moment later I hesitated because thinking about the origin of that, Quo Vadis Domine, I thought this might not be a good forecast for the euro. But then I thought, who nowadays will remember where this Quo Vadis comes from? But probably I was wrong on that. But financial investors have met so many challenges, so they will deal with this challenge too. And then I thought this Quo Vadis euro might give a bridge to another quotation. Many years later, I think there will be a saying, the euro still going strong. As a Swiss audience is always extremely critical to the euro, I'm well aware of that. Since many years I give speeches before the euro started, when it had started, etc. So just to summarize my position, may I refer to a very small anecdote. I gave a long interview to the Frankfurter Allgemeine Sonntagszeitung. And from this interview, they took the title, "The Euro Will Survive." And at the weekend, the editor called me and said, this title is not really sexy. No? Who will be invited to read this title, "The Euro Will Survive"? And then he apologized 3 times, and they said, are we allowed to say, "The euro will survive me"? And I said, I have no problem with that, but considering my age, this is not so encouraging. So I suggest the title, "The Euro Will Survive Me by Many, Many Years." So this was the final title. So I could stop here. But you might say, how come has this guy not realized the depths of the crisis, the dimension, the problems, discussion, and wherever in these days we go, I go, I'm confronted with this. I was recently 2 times in the US with an audience, and it was a strange experience because in the past I was glad if any of my friends in between many discussions, finally asked, what's going on in Europe? Now it's all about Europe. I was on a panel with Greenspan. He didn't say one word on the situation in the US. He talked about the crisis in Europe. And this is, I think, typical. The Chinese all are focused on the euro. And the media, I think, should pay a tribute to the euro, because without the euro, what would they write about? And in the context of all the summits, I would like to make you aware of that. Before any summit, European summit in the past, the Anglo-Saxon media presented a picture. Now from this summit, we have to expect the big bazooka, the big bang, great expectations. And I think they have already written the reaction to the result of a very disappointing after the summit. So what is behind that? What is driving that? I think the depths of the crisis makes it very clear one summit is not enough. I'm always concerned that the big bang would happen, because this would be a wrong decision. I will come back to that later. So I think to understand why we have this crisis, not of the euro, but of the euro area, and here especially of some countries. In some countries, I think it's like the chairman mentioned a few minutes ago, if one sometimes looks into the facts, the picture is very different. I was in a panel recently, and a journalist claimed Germany is in the deepest crisis ever. It's such a nonsense. No? For 2 years we had growth rates we hadn't seen for decades, but people have forgotten that. Here, the dimension of the crisis of the euro area is due to the fact that at least 3 developments came together. In this context, one should not, I think one has to go back to the introduction of the euro in January 1999. What happened then is that an experiment started in which 11 countries, very heterogeneous, participated. And I myself was warning against such a big group and to start it so early. Yesterday, a short discussion with the former Chancellor Gerhard Schröder. He called it the euro a Frühgeburt. This was also my judgment, but after it had started, it was there. And like in real life, if the baby comes too early, it's there. So we have to do everything that it thrives and is getting strong. And this was a challenge from the beginning. In the European Parliament, before I was nominated but not yet appointed, I said it in the Parliament, the euro, this is an experiment. Chirac, the then French president, said, this is the greatest monetary adventure of mankind. As a central banker, I'm not in favor of adventures, but it was an experiment, and I stressed that all the time, also being in office. And some of my colleagues after such events said to me, Otmar, are you still against the euro? I said, this is nonsense. But to make it a success, one has to work on the weak spots, and just saying always hurrah, this is not a solution. By the way, there were good reasons to say hurrah, because if you go back to the start of the euro, something has happened which nobody could have expected. As you are familiar with financial markets, make a test. If you would go into the monetary statistics of December 1998 and compare it to January 1999, you wouldn't see any significant reaction to the introduction of a new currency, to the disappearance of currencies like the DM. Long-term interest rates, people were concerned. Savers will move out to gold and dollar, etc. But nothing happened. Nothing happened. Inflation expectations. This was a new central bank, unexperienced, a few people. In Frankfurt, we were some 427 people. The national central banks, the staff was 55,000. So it was easy to say, this cannot work, this small, unexperienced group. But de facto, the introduction went so smoothly, and later, 3 years later, the greatest logistical challenge in peacetime, the introduction of new coins and notes, also went very smoothly. And in retrospect, all these things were going so well that under the surface, the problems were not always recognized. What went wrong from the beginning was that, as I said, we started with very heterogeneous countries, not fulfilling what economic theory would call an optimal currency area. So it started. So after the start with this baby born so early, one should have worked to correct these problems. The opposite happened. I'm not here, so to say, speaking as a German, but if you look carefully into the events, the only country in which the task was taken up and the right reforms were made after a while was Germany, because Germany started with an overvalued DM into monetary union, suffered from very high real interest rates because inflation rate was lower than other countries. The ECB is one size fits all, one central bank interest rate for all. And unemployment was extremely high. So the case that Germany today is in such a good position is due to the fact that over 10 years, unit labor costs were more or less flat. So in the beginning, this was a correction of an overvaluation. Later, it was gaining competitiveness in relation to others. And this was fostered by the fact that in other countries, the opposite happened. Let's not take always Greece. Take, for example, Portugal. In the first 10 years, unit labor costs in Portugal increased by 30% in relation to development in Germany. So if the Portuguese would still have had their former currency, the escudo, they would have devalued by, let's say, roughly 30%, and the country would have been back to square one. Italy, the same. So countries behaved as if they had still the instrument of exchange rate changes. But this was not the case, and the consequence was a decline in competitiveness within the monetary union. Today one might wonder why this could happen over so many years. It happened in the day of the light, not in the dark of the night. I remember in the first years, I accompanied the first president of the European Central Bank, Wim Duisenberg, to the Eurogroup, etc., and we already pointed to this fact. And later, Trichet, we ammunitioned him with all the graphs and tables for every second meeting of the Eurogroup. So this was heading to problems because over time, you lose competitiveness in a number of countries. This is reflected in current account imbalances, in current account deficits somewhere, in surpluses in other places. So this is the first development. And the second was that in some countries, real estate was in excess. There was a boom, especially in Spain and in Ireland. And here again, we from the ECB warned the Spanish authorities, the Irish authorities. This is something which will finally collapse. And it was certainly, you must not have studied economics to have seen that this development could not continue. And the longer it lasts, the greater the adjustment would be. And when this market collapsed, of course, banks were in problems. And to the extent that, like in Ireland, the state guaranteed the indebtedness of banks. Private indebtedness created banking problems. Banking problems created budget problems. So the debt ratio of public debt to GDP in Ireland exploded. And they have, so to say, wasted the efforts of a decade because Ireland had started, just to take this example, from a ratio, public debt to GDP, of high above 100%, had it brought down this ratio to below 30%. Below 30%. Great success. And now it's back to 100 because all this bulk of bad credits ended finally in the books of the Irish state. So this is the second development, which is separate, more or less separate from the first one. And the third issue which contributed to this crisis was the fact that monetary union was based on two main pillars. One pillar is a stable currency, guaranteed by an independent central bank with a clear mandate to maintain price stability. And the second pillar is the idea that, as we know from history, this country is a typical case for that, evidence for this sentence. A stable currency has to go along with solid public finance. This has to go together. We know it from history. And how to guarantee that in a monetary union with independent sovereign states? Because the 11 and now 17 members of monetary union do not form a state, they are sovereign states, restricted by a number of rules, but on budget, on taxes, etc., they are sovereign states. So the idea was to have some control on fiscal behavior on the European level. We introduced the Stability and Growth Pact. The Stability and Growth Pact was sometimes even ridiculed, especially by academics. How come that 3% is the limit for the deficit and 60% for the debt ratio? But so to say, the marketing for the pact was very bad, because the main message of the pact is that a country in normal times should have a balanced budget. And if you have a high debt, it's better to have a surplus to reduce the debt. And if this condition would have been fulfilled, then you have a long way, when a recession comes, you have a long way to go from a zero budget to minus 3%. This is 3 percentage points of GDP. So the Stability and Growth Pact did not limit, so to say, the room for maneuver for fiscal policies. It limited only to the extent that most countries didn't start from zero. They started from France over the time, always 2.5% in good times deficit. And just to jump into our days, what is happening now is the attempt that the failure of the Stability and Growth Pact is corrected by national rules, by a debt limit which is established at the national level. Like in Germany, where we have in the constitution now a debt limit in normal times of 3.5% of GDP in normal times. The first year in which this condition has to be fulfilled is 2016. And states should have, starting in 2020, a deficit of zero. So this is something on the 9th of December was decided that every country should have that in her own national legislation. And not to trust to the Stability and Growth Pact, which was, by the way, one could say, killed by France and Germany in 2003 and 2004. They violated the pact and organized a political majority against the application of the rules. And my concern is that if you look into the discussions which are going on, the resistance to automatic sanctions, which was an idea already presented in the 90s, the resistance against automatic sanctions implies a simple fact, which is politics want to have the final control on the application of sanctions. And so my concern is if a situation like 2003-04 will happen again in the future, especially the big countries will again violate the rules. So what we need is control of markets. And here it's interesting also to look into the past, when over almost 10 years, spreads between government bonds across the euro area were not existent. It were the spreads of 25, 30 basis points were just expression of liquidity differences, because larger markets like for German bonds are more liquid, so it's explainable just for liquidity reasons that markets for Greek, Portuguese bonds would have some liquidity negative premium, but not more. And I remember in this moment at the ECB, we looked into that, and we organized, I was already also responsible for economics and research, so we organized 2 studies to look into that. And one of our young researchers looked very carefully into the news on public expenditure in a number of countries and the reaction of financial markets to negative news. Let's say a negative news on Italy fails to present a balanced budget or something like that. So you would expect that markets would react to that. And the reaction he discovered was tremendous. It was 2 basis points. 2 basis points, and after a week it had disappeared again. So markets wonder, I ask you, they didn't believe in the no bailout clause, or it was herd behavior, combination of that. But finally, when the new government in Greece came into office after the election and looked into the books and said, oh, the budget is not 3.7% as we had thought so far, it's 14%. I think it's the biggest correction ever in history. And then markets, from this moment on, looked very carefully into development in different countries. And since financial markets, of course, markets overshoot sometime, but basically they gave the right direction in watching countries and rating agencies. Have no reason to defend rating agencies. What they have done in the context of subprime was a disaster, we know. But here today, they are criticized in the European Union. Politicians, if you talk to politicians, they are like, reaction is almost mad, as if rating agencies had created the problems. They react to the problems. One can discuss the timing. There are strange moments in which rating agencies have presented their newest grading. But all in all, it's quite interesting to see Mario Monti, the new Prime Minister of Italy, when he was asked about his reaction to the downgrading by Standard & Poor's of his country, he said, I'm not surprised. More or less, I could have written this report myself. I think take this in contrast to comments by politicians. And now there is the idea to create a European rating agency as a kind of counterweight to the American 3 rating agencies. By the way, one of them has a majority of French investors. Only as a side remark. So I'm always in favor of competition. I remember when I was at the Bundesbank at the board in the 90s, there was already an initiative to create a German or a European rating agency. But investors finally shied away from the risk because they want to make money. And the idea to have a European rating agency, which is a public institution, this is, for me, a crazy idea, because think for a moment that a rating agency with a public institution would have to rate countries. Then the conflict is immediately on the table. So private, okay. Then we have 3 voices, we have 4 voices. But they have the same data and they will come more or less to the same judgment. If it's otherwise, in discussion with politicians recently, I said to one of them, you are reacting like a patient who is told that his fever is now exceeding 40%, and to solve the problem, you destroy the thermometer. This is, I think, not the right solution to solve a problem. So we have 3 elements, divergence of competitiveness, collapse of real estate markets and banking problems in some countries, and finally violations of the rule of solid public finance, which in combination have created the dimension of the crisis. I myself was convinced early that the crisis is in the pipeline. And for that, I think you must not be a great forecaster. It was obvious. And you might react and say, okay, from hindsight, we are all more clever than in forecasting. No, I wrote it. The last chapter of my book, which was written on the euro, which was written before long before the crisis emerged in this dimension. The headline was Europe at the Crossroads. So I did not expect the dimension of the crisis, but that the crisis against this development, especially in divergence of competitiveness, was unavoidable, was clear. And for me, the crisis would have been a big chance to correct, to work on the problems of the euro area which existed from the beginning. And this chance is still there. I was told that in China, the word for crisis has two elements. One element is danger, and the other element is chance. This is also the Greek origin of the word. And if you look for a moment on the situation, of course, a lot has still to be done. But since a year, Europe, and in this case, Europe is something which is north of Switzerland and south of Switzerland and east of Switzerland and west of Switzerland. It's easier to talk about Europe in the UK. For them it's UK. This is this little island which is separated from the big country UK by the channel. So the dimension of Europe, I mention it because today there are many discussions about Europe. And what do you mean by Europe? I think Switzerland belongs to Europe, but in a certain sense it doesn't belong to this euro area. So if we take the euro area, if we take also some other European countries, a lot has changed. For a moment, the most dramatic development is that the crisis, which is connected to the existence of the euro, certainly, has thrown out two governments from office. Recently, in a conference, somebody said, thanks to the euro and the crisis, we finally got rid of Berlusconi. There are others who say the power of financial markets is such that democratically elected governments are wiped off. This can't be correct. But it's a reaction which is in line with, obviously, the will of the population, because Mario Monti and his government, they are supported, not so much by the parliament majority, but by the wish of the people to deal with the problems, finally with the problems of the country. So what's happening in Spain, in Portugal, you could say it's too little, too late, okay, but things are happening which 2 years ago nobody would have expected. So a lot is changing, but it's certainly not enough. It's certainly not enough. So the euro area is at the crossroads, and this has to be seen in a wider context. Good friend of mine, famous Harvard professor Martin Feldstein, who was extremely critical on the euro concept. He even predicted danger of war before it started, and like Milton Friedman, in the first weeks when I was in office in June 1998 in the Euro Tower, I received many letters, congratulations, etc. Wish you all the best. This is usual stuff. I got one letter from Milton Friedman, the Nobel Prize winner. We were friends since long. Said, "Dear Otmar, congratulations on an impossible job. You know, I'm convinced this cannot work." And then he was nice enough to say, "Collapse might be somewhat delayed because of your presence, but in the end is unavoidable." And Martin Feldstein, the same. I'm not sure if he would have said this sentence because of your presence, but he was convinced. And he has recently written an article, and he said, the Europeans have problems they would not have had without the euro. And there is more than some truth in it. We have specific problems because of the euro. But this is only one side of the coin. When I read this article, I was reminded of the comment, marriage is seen as a solution to problems you would not have if you would stay alone. I don't know what is your reaction to that, but one might say partly true, but this is one side of the coin. On marriage, hopefully for all of you, there is another much brighter side. And on the euro, the question is, what would be the case without the euro? And this, with or without, is very difficult to analyze because we never exactly know what would have happened without the euro. But for me, the decisive moment is the comparison with 1992-93. At that time, we had the exchange rate mechanism, fixed exchange rates, and in the crisis, speculation against different currencies. The UK, British pound left at that time, and the finance minister was whistling in the bathroom, the Black Wednesday, he called it a White Wednesday. Take the case of Italy. The Italian lira devalued against the DM in a very short period of time by 30%. Talking about those numbers, you might have some comparison in mind. I remember very well that at that time, quite a number of companies in Germany, southern Germany, Austria, etc., went bankrupt because one moment, 30% change in price competitiveness, your competitor gains 30%, you lose 30%. They were immediately cut off from a number of markets. And at that time, even the single market was at stake because there was pressure to introduce kind of import duties, to close markets, etc., against this this undeserved gains in competitiveness. I'm convinced, and this has influenced my mind substantially, that the single market over time would not have survived with such a kind of exchange regime in which you have such abrupt changes in competitiveness. So this is part of the other side of the coin. And imagine for a moment, in 1992, it was George Soros who invested $10 billion, and in a few days he made $1 billion profit on the devaluation of the British pound. In today's financial markets, 10 billion is, what is the Frankfurt word, peanuts. If such gains are hoped for, then much greater sums would be involved. And imagine for a moment, after the outbreak of the financial market crisis, after the Lehman case, if financial market crisis would have swept over into foreign exchange markets, we would have turbulent foreign exchange markets. This would have fired back on financial markets. I think we would have a sequence of chaotic events. So I think this is the other side of the coin, which Martin Feldstein didn't mention. So how do we go from here to the future? Europe, Euro area is really at the crossroads. And the reaction to this crisis reveals that basically two camps are competing, I'm not saying fighting against each other. One camp starts from the fact that to start with monetary union without political union was a mistake. The former Chancellor Helmut Kohl, when he presented the Maastricht Treaty to the German Bundestag, at that time still in Bonn, he said it would be absurd to create a monetary union without political union. So when monetary union started in January 1999, we had no political union. So the reaction of quite a number of politicians, etc., is academics, journalists, is this is the moment in which we have to finalize this unfinished house. We have to jump into political union. And the buzzword for that is now we need fiscal union. We need fiscal union. Now there are many ideas what a fiscal union might imply. I have come to the conclusion that if you think through, fiscal union is inconceivable in the end without a fully fledged political union. Because if fiscal union means that you have a European level which decides on public expenditure and taxes, in a democracy, this can only happen if you have a democratic legitimation for such decisions. Let me explain what this, in my mind, excludes. Or let's first start saying, I've participated now in so many discussions in different committees, etc., on this way to political union. I think political union of this kind, fiscal union, means you need a real European government, you need a real European Parliament, you need elections, etc. Then the question is what is left to state governments, German Bundestag, etc. And I don't see any way that this would be accepted. You would need referenda in some countries, etc. I think this is a vision for the future. So, and people know it. Those who are in favor of fiscal union know it. So what they are trying to achieve is, I would call it a fiscal union and political union through the back door of transfers. And the most dangerous, in my eyes, dangerous evidence for that would be Eurobonds. Eurobonds, which has many supporters. Eurobonds, by Eurobonds I mean that national governments would issue bonds for which there is a common guarantee of all participating states. There are very different versions of that, but it boils down to that. This would have, of course, an immediate positive effect on high indebted countries because they would immediately enjoy much lower interest rates. Now, if all countries are responsible for this guarantee, these bonds, the long-term interest rates for a number of countries would immediately decline. And financial markets would be happy to have such an instrument which is safe, AAA or double A at least. The negative side of the coin in this case is that interest rates would rise in countries which so far enjoyed very low interest rates, because over time, for a country like Germany, guarantees would add up to a multiple of GDP. And rating agencies, to take this, those have already warned, that Germany would over time certainly lose its AAA, AA or whatsoever. So this would have two very negative consequences. The first negative consequence is moral hazard problem in those countries who enjoy suddenly lower interest rates without having done anything by themselves. You are rewarded by the common guarantee without having made any individual effort on your side. So how could a government in Italy or wherever explain to the people that we need reforms if you get lower interest rates just as a kind of gift? Reform efforts would immediately decline. This is the moral hazard side of the problem. The moral hazard side on the other side is that you are punished for solid behavior in the past. And I think the most important argument against this kind of bonds, against Euro bonds, is the fact that this would imply a transfer of taxpayers' money from more solid countries to other countries without any legitimization. It would not be the parliament who would decide on that. It would just happen. And this is violation of a principle which is, the word is no taxation without representation. We know the Boston Tea Party, not the present Tea Party in the US, but starting the War of Independence of the US. It started because taxation was decided in London without any participation votes in the colony in the US. I'm not predicting war, but problems. And people certainly would realize it, and this would substantially undermine support of people for the project of Europe. So Eurobonds, I think, is an incarnation of a wrong approach. Another wrong way would be that if the two rescue funds, ESM and ESFS, would be endowed with a banking license. This is also an idea, because it would imply that finally these funds would have access to the European Central Bank, and which finally would be monetary financing of public expenditure, which is forbidden by the treaty. And one of the basic elements of a monetary union without a state, with sovereign states instead of that, is the no bailout principle. The no bailout principle means that you are responsible for your own economic policies, good or bad. And no bailout principle in the treaty forbids even giving help. Not only forbids asking for help, but also forbids giving help. This is the idea, this is the construction of a monetary union with independent states. So on 9th of September, the last summit, there were a number of decisions which basically strengthened fiscal control at home in individual countries. And I think the most important decision was that Eurobonds and these banking licenses were not accepted. It was the German Chancellor, she resisted those requests, but I'm fully aware this is not the end of these initiatives, because there is strong support for the idea of Eurobonds and for banking licenses. This is anything but dead. You see, the crossroad reaction to the crisis of the euro area is directing in two very different directions. One direction is strengthening the political framework in the direction of a political union. The other way is strengthening the rule-based framework, because this multi-union is based on treaties, on commitments by countries, Stability and Growth Pact, etc. And all these, not all, but quite a number of these treaties were violated. And this cannot be continued, has to be strengthened. And to go in this direction is, so to say, a very different reaction to the crisis. But the struggle which is going on is between, let's say, these two camps. And some final words. On the one hand, I'm convinced that compared to, let's say, last summer, when we met in Frankfurt, I think the situation has substantially improved. This is in contrast to all the downgrading. I think the downgrading by rating agencies should have happened much earlier, because at present, what's going on in Italy, in Portugal, in Spain, in many countries is encouraging. Again, more has to be done. And the final challenge is not only to present solid public finance, which is tough enough. The biggest challenge is to create growth. To create growth, and for the Italian government, for example, and Monti is fully aware of that, the first step, a number of courageous decisions. We had a visit of the acting finance minister of Italy, Vittorio Grilli, last week in Frankfurt. Had a long discussion with him. What they have done is tremendous. The pension reform goes much beyond what is achieved and still discussed in Germany, because life expectancy, I personally hope for that, is still continually increasing. So saying we have to work until 67 is not the end of the story. And the Italian pension reform first is implemented much earlier. In Germany, it's extended over, I don't know, many years, 10 years or so. Every year, 2 months is in small steps. This is something which will create resistance every time when this comes, will become part of election campaigns, etc. So we have to see how it will be realized. Here it comes more or less at one stroke and has an implicit reaction to further increases in life expectancy. So these are courageous steps. And when there were some strikes in Italy, as usually, I think it was 4 hours, and Monti said, I would have expected many more hours. So we have to do it, whatever the street is telling, and people more or less understand it. But now, and I take the case of Italy, I could talk about Greece, in which it's much more difficult and really very bad. Creating growth means that you have to reform the structure of your economy. And here in Italy, in Greece, in Portugal, in many countries, we have a system which is to a large extent still organized in kind of guilds which existed in the medieval times. In Germany, for example, just to give an example, in 1958, before we had a rule that if somebody had studied pharmacy, finished university, and wanted to open a pharmacy, you had to ask for a license. And there was a public institution to which you addressed this request. And this institution asked the experts. And the experts were existing owners of pharmacies. And the reaction was, no, we don't need new pharmacies. Does anybody complain that she doesn't get her medicine? No, so there's no need. And normally this request was declined. So when somebody went to the Constitutional Court, and the court decided this is a violation of the fundamental right of free access to profession. So this was immediately changed, and since normally you can open a pharmacy in the same street, etc., this is part of competition. This is true for taxes, for lawyers, etc. And in Italy, this is the most difficult part to achieve, to break up this, because all this lobby group are represented in parliament, etc., and there is strong resistance. But without that, you don't get growth, and we need both. Fiscal consolidation alone will not make it. Growth has also to be re-established. And here you see, and I come back where we started, with the introduction of the euro, it was the establishment of a framework which is dominated, you could say, by the idea that this is a new currency which is a stable currency, guaranteed by an independent central bank. And then you have a strong pillar for the whole economy. And I wonder how many politicians understood what they really signed in Maastricht. Because if you look into the Maastricht Treaty, there is no word on labor markets, on wages, etc., all that. It's not there. But the introduction of a common currency and a single monetary policy, removal of the instrument of changing exchange rates, has totally changed the framework of economies joining the euro. And the adoption to this new regime takes time, and the longer it is delayed, the greater the problems. And what is happening now is late, hopefully not too late, reactions to this regime. This adjustment process is strongly underway, and as I said at the beginning, I'm sure that the euro will not only survive me, but by many years. And I think there are good reasons, because also I think the existence of the euro is in the interest also of the world economic system. In this moment, I remember when I was at the Bundesbank, it was shortly before the start of the euro. And here in Switzerland, it was in Zurich in a big conference, was finally a panel, and very critical views on that. Do you believe this will be a stable currency, etc., etc.? And then my reaction, I will never forget, was there's one country in which people should pray for the stability of the euro. And this is the country in which I'm presently speaking. And this was, of course, my friends in the Swiss National Bank were fully aware of that. Because otherwise, if you have so close a weak currency, then you have speculation, etc., all that, which has materialized. So the euro is an anchor currency much beyond the 17 member countries. It's an anchor currency for Eastern Europe. Denmark, for example, it's totally bound to the euro. It's not member of the euro group, but has fixed exchange rates in every respect. And for the world economic system, the euro is the second most important currency in the world. Currency reserves are 27% is euro, is on the euro, 66, something like that on the dollar. For the rest, it's more or less scattered. We don't know what the renminbi will be. I think it's a natural candidate for a kind of third international currency. But we have to see the euro crisis, the euro area crisis, also in the context of the world monetary system, of the world monetary system, and so it's not so surprising that the focus is now on Europe, on the euro area, on the euro. But my message, as I said before, the euro will be going strong for many years. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Issing. Very interesting. Now, your opportunity to ask any questions that might have come up.
I'm not from England. I'm from Europe, from a small country across the island in England. Churchill was here in Zurich a long time ago, and his famous speech said he wanted us Europeans to be together, but he said at the end that, of course, Britain would stay where they were. And when we follow the press over the past 5 years, and I still read The Economist, but if you read it, you get sick. I wanted to ask you what your views are on the role of sterling, Britain. I don't even know whether they're AAA still, or they seem to have a wonderful way to all disguise this for us, and they're bashing Europe and bashing the Germans and so forth. And I know I'm getting quite popular with my friends here because I wanted to know what influence they could play on destabilizing all our efforts to save the euro and come to European unity. And this includes, of course, this wonderful center that we have in London, the enormous amounts of money they can play with, shorten Europe in a way. And I'd like to hear your views on it.
This is indeed a question which would need another speech and more. When you mentioned Churchill's speech in September 1946, I once gave a speech in the same room. There's a sign saying Winston Churchill gave this famous speech, and as you mentioned, Churchill, 1946, asked for creating a European family. So immediately after the war, so it's really, if you read the speech, it's moving. But as you also mentioned, he finally said, our place, UK, is not. It's in the Commonwealth of Nations. I think the Commonwealth is gone. So what is where UK is belonging to? I think UK is positioned always between following the Americans and the other hand dealing with the Europeans. This is has been a continuous, not battle, but the UK never knew where they really belong now in this new world, because independence is limited in today's world. And the interest of the UK economy is very strong on the euro area. It's the largest, the most important partner in exports and imports. And changes in the exchange rate have a tremendous influence on the UK. I think this 9th of December summit was a strange event. It was more reflecting problems of Cameron with his own party than representing British interest. And the Scots have also a different view on that. I personally think it would be very bad if the UK would finally leave the Euro Union, which is not fully excluded, but it would be to the detriment of the UK economy. And in the European Union, I know from many officials in Brussels, politicians, that they are fed up with all the problems the British create. On the other hand, I think we need such a voice which is warning against too much centralization, etc. I think this is Switzerland does not represent this role, unfortunately. We need that contribution. So it's, I think, in common interest. Let me conclude by referring to occasion which goes back to 1955. In 1992, the Montanunion, common market for coal and steel, was created with 6 members. And the idea was to continue, and then there was even the idea to have a European Defence Union of these 6 countries, and it was voted down by the Assemblée Nationale. And then there was an impasse of integration, and then there was a famous conference in Messina. Out of that finally came the European Common Market project. And the British were invited. And the British delegation left after a few days. And the reaction of the British to these discussions was, these Europeans will never agree on that. In the unlikely case they will agree on something, they will not be able to implement it. And if in the even more unlikely case they will implement it, it will become a disaster. So they left the conference. A year later, the Treaty of Rome was signed, and the Common Market project started, and soon Britain was knocking on the door, and de Gaulle said no. So it took many years before the British were allowed to join. I think I was participating in a conference in which I got the question, it's years ago, and today nobody would ask this question, I think, for a time being at least. Can you imagine that Britain will ever join the euro? And I said, it's very unlikely. For a moment it's excluded, but in principle, in the end, the British are pragmatic. I could consider a combination of 2 conditions that they might consider to join. The first condition is that there is a macroeconomic mess in the UK. I think this condition is fulfilled. The second condition is, on the continent, everything goes much better. This condition certainly is not fulfilled. It's not fulfilled, but I think the relation is very complex, complicated. It's made complicated by history, etc. So this is, to some part, an element which is helpful to create a sustainable Europe. On the other hand, it's also making progress very, very difficult. So it's going on.
Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4th row there. If you would hand this gentleman a microphone.
I have a question. I understand you're very positive about the euro surviving. The question I have, and I want to ask you, do you think it's a legitimate question, is will the euro survive with its current membership?
It's a different question, and it's legitimate, of course. If you would have asked me, let's say 2 years ago, I would have said yes. The present composition, not only the euro, but it will survive with the present members, 17, and more to come. I'm not so clear about that and sure about that anymore. I've come to the conclusion that the case of Greece is hopeless. When the European Central Bank in July last year, in its monthly bulletin, published a scenario in which public debt would first rise from 120 to 160% and decline to 120 over a period of 10 years, based on the assumption of modest but constant growth. And the conclusion was, we have demonstrated that sustainability is possible. I think the figures for me were telling the opposite. I think no country democratic or less democratic, can continue fiscal consolidation over a period of 10 years. You have elections in between. This is a very unrealistic assumption, and there was no reason why growth could come back to a sustainable level over such a period of time. In the meantime, the debt ratio is even going above 160%, approaching 200%. This debt restructuring will bring some relief, but it's also part of struggling and negotiations. I'm often quoted as having asked for throwing Greece out. I've never said that, also not because it's not possible. A country cannot be excluded. My question was only if you continue to talk to a country and say, next time, if you have not delivered on your commitments, you don't get any more money. And this was continued time and again. If you have children, if you educate your children in that way, next time, even try it with your dog, you see the result. So I think my consideration was, if there is no basis for continuing financial help, which the money has gone somewhere, it has not really helped the people in Greece, I think this has to be stopped. And then it's up to the Greeks to decide what to do. Not to impose anything on them, but stop financing endlessly.
Okay, there was another question, very nearby.
I have two related questions. One is, you talk about restructuring for growth, which is a worthy aim, but do you think it's really consistent with fiscal austerity? And secondly, is there sufficient time to implement fiscal austerity before the crisis escalates to the next level?
I think I combine the two questions. What we have seen since a while is a race between reforms, fiscal consolidation, and market expectations. And politicians say we are driven by markets. Markets have taken command. If you don't do the right reforms, then you are continuously under pressure of markets. But this is not because markets have gone beyond democracy, but because reforms are delayed, are too timid. I was always convinced that if a country presents a credible reform program, then markets will take a positive reaction. And we have seen parts of that in the case of Ireland. Spreads have come down from skyrocket levels. Of course, some volatility in it, but interest rates have come substantially down. In Italy, you see the auctions, it's still short-term debt, but markets are full of liquidity. So investors are sitting on so much liquidity. And finally, you need an alternative to cash. Risk. Today's newspapers have a message. Quite a number of American investors, money market funds, etc., are taking again more risks, which means lending to European banks, etc., because alternatives are so delivering so meager returns. So money is coming back. But for that you need a credible commitment. And I'm fully convinced that if Italy continues this reform process, and if Monti is able to bring through the structural reforms through the parliament, Italian bond rates will come down even more substantial. But markets will always react if some reform process is delayed, then spreads go up. So this will be a continuous process, and I welcome this because this is the best control of politics. Increase in long-term rates are an immediate punishment. The finance minister goes home to his cabinet colleagues and says, we cannot afford, we have to do something. And this is underway. This is underway. You cannot observe from week to week. But it's too early to claim victory, but it's going in the right direction. But it's certainly not yet finished.
Oh, now that you mentioned liquidity and these Italian bond auctions, of course, that was also thanks to the ECB. So would you say that the ECB strategy has worked? Now that we do see that liquidity, A, is not a problem, that investors are seeking for alternatives, and even the latest Italian and Spanish bond issues were quite successful, at least the short-term ones.
When I left the ECB, I have sworn an oath to myself. Never comment policies of your former institution. The guys who have left should shut their mouths, not make. I hate it when I was in office and former colleagues gave public interviews what we should do, and I sworn to myself I never will do it. I acted once against this when the ECB started buying government bonds directly in the market, because I think this is against the spirit of the Treaty of Monetary Financing. The ECB has explained it with improving the conditions of its monetary policy. But I was also against that because it undermines reform efforts. When the Berlusconi government, when Italian bonds, Berlusconi was still in office, when Italian bonds collapsed, spreads rose, the government has immediately reacted. And when the ECB started to buy Italian bonds and the spreads shrunk, the efforts were already reacting and declining. But on all the other issues, I keep to my oath.